Welcome to New Zealand, everybody. We've just arrived. We've flown halfway around the world from Iceland here to New Zealand. We're starting here in Queenstown as our base of operations to catch our bearings before we start traveling around some of the most beautiful areas of the South Island. Now, it's very different down here. We were in Iceland, we were in the peak of winter, but since we've transitioned into the southern hemisphere, we are now in the peak of summer. In Iceland, we had really short winter days and the sun never rose too high, so we had soft, filtered light the whole time. Here in the middle of the summer, the sun clocks all the way over the sky, so we have really long days and a lot of harsh lighting conditions during the day, so we're going to be focusing right around sunrises and sunsets. We're going to have a lot of different varying weather conditions in New Zealand, because if one thing that happens in New Zealand that's a constant is the weather variation. Sometimes they call it 4 seasons in one day. Now, New Zealand is really special because it has been made very popular by The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings movies, and ever since then, people have flocked here by the thousands to see these epic landscapes. But the nice thing about New Zealand is the atmosphere is always crystal clear, so you can see for miles and miles, and these landscapes are huge. There's also a huge diversity in the types of landscapes. We have high mountains, we have plains, highlands, lowlands, glaciers, pretty much every kind of shooting location imaginable, all contained in these 2 little islands. Now, we're going to be focusing on the South Island, and we're going to be visiting some of the most beautiful spots and some of my favorite locations, and I'm hoping that we come away with some amazing things to show you guys. Iceland was meant to give us an introduction to landscape photography and to start things off very simple, but now that we've come to New Zealand, I'm going to ramp up the difficulty a little bit and start introducing some advanced topics. While we're traveling to different locations here in New Zealand, we're not only going to be introducing more advanced topics in camera and in the field, but we're also going to be looking at more advanced post-processing methods and different tricks we can use to get some more complex and beautiful imagery. So we have this crazy big van that we're going to be driving all over the South Islands, and I'm really excited to show you guys some of these spots. When we were in Iceland, we had everything mapped out so that we could circle the ring road. Here in New Zealand, we're trying to keep the schedule a little bit more organic, and we're also going to get off the highway a little bit and even hike to some remote areas that are very beautiful. So I'm really excited to share this stuff with you guys, and I'm really excited to get this started. Lake Wanaka has become famous for sunrises, and in Iceland, we were lucky to get up at 10:30 a.m. for our sunrises, but in New Zealand, the sun rose much earlier at 7 a.m. I'm currently standing in Lake Wanaka, which is part of Wanaka. It's a beautiful little town in the South Island of New Zealand. In the middle of this lake, near the shore, is this beautiful lone tree. It's the only single tree that grows in all of the lake. It's a really beautiful spot for photography, and it's become very famous and very iconic among photographers who travel to New Zealand. I first saw photos of this tree a couple years ago, and ever since I saw them, I knew I had to visit. It's just amazing. It's almost like somebody a few years ago decided to plant it there just for photographers. You can walk all the way around the bank, and the tree makes this perfect reflection in the water, and at sunrise, the sun rises off to the right, and it starts to change the color of the sky, the color of the clouds, and sometimes you even get beautiful golden light on this tree and on the mountain range behind it. It's absolutely spectacular for photography in the morning. This is the second morning we arrived here. Both mornings we have woken up at about 5:30 to arrive here at 6 a.m. for the sunrise. Sunrise happens at about 7. I didn't like yesterday. It was a really clear sky. There was beautiful light, but there wasn't much interest in the sky. My vision for this scene was specifically for a long exposure where I wanted to soften this water, but I also wanted streaky colors in the sky. So yesterday really didn't deliver, but today was amazing. You guys might remember we've been talking about solid neutral density filters, and I've been using my 4 and 10 stop filters to soften water. Remember back in Iceland, we were working with the waterfalls, and I wanted to get that soft, streaky effect in the water. Well, the same thing applies here, but I'm adding an additional element. So along with my 4-stop solid neutral density filter, I'm introducing a 3-stop graduated filter. Now the reason being is it's not just a solid long exposure I want. If I do a solid long exposure, the sky is going to be blown out. It's going to be overexposed. So the graduated neutral density filter allows me to adjust and add an extra up to 1 to 3 stops of neutral density in the sky. So I can expose for the foreground and the tree while still exposing correctly for the sky as well. Now, when I'm not using filters, you guys know that I use bracketing, and in post-processing, I can combine multiple exposures together. But when I'm dealing with exposure times of 1 to 2 minutes and the light changing so quickly, it's very important to me that I get everything in a single RAW. The reason this filter combination works so well in this scene is that the sky is the brightest part of the image, so it's always going to be the most exposed out of my long exposure. That 3-stop grad allows me to tone it back and give it an even exposure throughout the frame. So the water, being the darkest element here, is equally exposed with the sky. And I can adjust this by sliding it up and down to move that neutral density target lower or higher on my frame to compensate for how much sky I want to expose for. There are quite a few types of graduated neutral density filters. There's a soft graduated filter, which is the one that I'm using here and I use most often. There's also a hard graduated filter, which is made for flat horizons. The nice thing about the soft is it allows you to use it when there's mountains or any kind of ridges, trees, or uneven horizons because it's a soft gradation into neutral density. The other types are reverse ND grads, which I don't personally use, but they are available as well for different techniques. As I said, we arrived here really early, way before the sun started shedding any light on this scene, so I was sort of experimenting with different compositions. The tricky thing with this shot is, even though you can move all along the shore of this lake and get a beautiful composition, the sunrise is pretty far over there, so I had to watch the clouds as they changed. And as the clouds started to change, I knew I needed to take my shoes off and get a little bit closer to the tree. So here's the reason why I decided to get close to the tree with a wide angle instead of standing far on the shore and zooming in. If I stood far, zooming in, the tree is actually going to be below the horizon because as I shift back, that mountain starts to shift up and the tree starts to be eaten by the shape of the mountain. The closer I get to the tree and the lower I get with my tripod, the more the tree sticks out in the sky. So it's not hidden. The detail of the tree is not hidden by the mountain. It's actually accentuated by the lightness of the sky. So I get this nice contrast, the dark tree against a very bright and colorful sky. It's also interesting here because most of the shots I've done in this tutorial, I've locked down the camera because I picked the composition that I like the most. Now this one's very special because so many different compositions work and I have to really read the clouds. So the best case scenario, and I was able to nail a couple really good shots here, was with all of the colors of the clouds changing behind the tree. So the clouds tend to change as the sun comes up in different phases. So usually the clouds closest to the sun start to change color first. So I'd hook around and have the sun behind the tree. And then as the clouds started to change further away from the sunrise, I started to move further and further around to continuously capture the colors in the sky. Now mixed with long exposure, the colors streak across the sky and it looks really beautiful in frame. By this point, you guys have also noticed that I like to use a lot of frame blending, which means that I leave the camera in one place, capture the scene throughout time, and then blend different moments together. That's a really powerful tool, but for something like this, I really don't have the time or the luxury because the sky changes so quick. So I have to adapt to the situation, move, and try to get the best single frame as possible. And with long exposure photography, going for a 1 to a 2 minute exposure, I don't have time for bracketing as well. So if I start bracketing long exposures, I'm talking about maybe 5 or 6 minutes for one shot. I just need to be able to shoot for 1 or 2 minutes, change things, and move on and keep adapting to the scene as it changes. I have some experience with this location. I've been here a few times before, and we actually now have 2 mornings here, and the conditions change each time. In a perfect world, this would be flat calm and we'd have a beautiful still reflection of the tree in the water. We would also have less wind. Now, wind in trees will ruin long exposures. The wind kicked up for a little while this morning, but thankfully it calmed down and I was able to get a solid 1 minute exposure. So sometimes when I come here, it's perfect conditions. Sometimes we have to adapt to the changing conditions. But all in all, this morning came out pretty good. Now the benefit of shooting long exposure when the water's choppy like this is I can still get a reflection of the tree, because as the water starts to smooth out, I'll get a soft reflection. It won't be a perfect reflection, but you'll notice that there'll be a soft mirror effect of the tree that I wouldn't be able to get if I wasn't shooting a long exposure. A little advice on this location too, if you do get here in the morning, that tree is home to some really big birds. There's like a colony of 12 to 15 of them. So once that sun starts to come up, they're gonna start moving around, shaking the tree, and waking up and doing their morning routine. So what I like to do is scare them away. When I was here a year ago, this lake was really dry, so the tree was just coming right up to the ground, so I could walk up to the tree and scare the birds. I just ran right up. But this time it's pretty far out in the water, so we actually flew the drone and hovered it over the tree on both sides to scare the birds away. My advice is to scare them away before other people get here, because they think you're being mean to the birds. They don't understand that you're just trying to get them out of the tree so you can get the perfect shot. So we were able to scare the birds away very early, and they weren't disrupting the frame. I took a lot of different shots, and we're gonna show you guys some of my favorites. Once the light started getting good, my settings remain the same. Now remember, I'm using a 4-stop solid filter and a 3-stop grad. Now that grad changes as I shift it up and down. So push it all the way down, and I end up with about 7 stops of neutral density. Push it all the way up, and I may end up with about 5 just on the top of the frame. So it gave me some wiggle room to be able to adjust my exposure. Now with my Nikon D810, I was shooting in f8, I was shooting at ISO 64, and I was trying to average my exposures around 1 minute. 1 minute will fully soften this water and give nice streaky clouds in the sky. Now of course I'm using my timed release, so I locked it down, and I was very careful to monitor the time so I could keep it right around 1 minute. Now when you're dealing with scenes like this, it's my experience that 1 and 2 minutes look very similar. And since there is a little bit of wind, I decided to go with 1 minute just because it's safer than 2. You guys will notice when you're working with long exposure that water will start to get worse over time. There's a point where it's perfect, and in this case, right around 1 minute is perfect. But as 2 to 3 to 4 minutes start to happen, it won't get any better. It'll just pick up more and more of the reflections from the sky, and in a lot of cases, it'll start to turn white. So all I'm trying to do is find that perfect mark, and in this case, it was 1 minute just to have it perfectly smooth and flat. The only variable outside of the water here is the sky, and in this case the clouds were moving enough that 1 minute also gave it a nice effect. As you can see, the sun's starting to come up, which has given me a completely different image that I'm not really interested in capturing. This is going to be a little bit different. We're going to take a few of these into Photoshop. We're going to look at these. These are single raws, so we're going to do a lot to get as much out of the raw in the shadows as we can and balance those lights, darks, and the colors. Just another note of the scene before I close things up here. I was shooting at a very warm white balance at about 6,700 Kelvin. With long exposure, remember, I've always said that you want to lock down your Kelvin. You don't want to shoot in auto mode because you want consistency. So that warm Kelvin was able to give me a nice warm scene, so I should have some nice pink and red hues to work with in the sky. So let's take a look at these in Photoshop and see how we can make them even better. All right, welcome to lesson 9. This is the first lesson in New Zealand together. This is the Wanaka tree in beautiful Lake Wanaka. If you guys watched the video portion before this, you saw that I started to introduce both a solid and a graduated neutral density filter. And as the lighting was happening, all the beautiful light, I started to move around to position myself in the best possible position. So this Lightroom file that we're looking at together right now is going to look a little bit light because only one of the shots had the color that I was looking for, and I was shooting 60-second exposures. So by the time this exposure was done and I did another 60-second exposure, the light was already finished. So by positioning myself constantly, I was able to get the nice light, the nice soft sky, and the nice soft water. So this one, the shooting was a lot more complicated than the post-processing since all the lighting is already in place. So in Lightroom here, we're just going to take a look at a few of the same tools we've used, and I'm going to introduce a new tool before we move into Photoshop to do the final color corrections and tweaks. So let's go ahead and begin. So if you open up the Lightroom file here, I'm already in the Develop module, you see that there is one file, and it's a little bit overexposed. So I was shooting at f8, 61 seconds, 16 millimeter, ISO 64. So I probably could have gone up to around f11 and underexpose this, but this is still workable. So what we're going to do first is tone down these highlights so that we can get more of these nice pink values back, because the sky had much more color, but the camera picked it up. It's a little bit more flat than I'd like, so let's go ahead and make our initial adjustments just by changing the highlights a little bit. And you can see the highlights don't change it too much, so I'm going to pull the exposure down just a little bit, and I'm going to add a little bit of contrast and bump the shadows to get some of the detail. Now right now it looks pretty nice, there's some nice color, the color mirrors the reflection, but here's where we're going to take it a little bit further. Now imagine in camera if I would have warmed it up a little bit more, if I would have changed the Kelvin. I was using a custom Kelvin of 7850, but I could probably go anywhere up to about 10,000 to start to change this and make it even more warm. So let's see what happens when we start to move that temperature just to the right, and I'm going to go ahead and warm it up. And that's going to start to add more yellow. Well, yellow definitely warms it up, but yellow is not exactly what I want. I want these pink and purple tones in the sky. So what I'm going to do is find a balance between changing the custom temperature and the tint. So we're going to bring those pinks back. And there we go. Now this is pretty good. It might be a little too intense, but we're going to work on it a little bit more after we do a couple other things. You don't want to go too far. If I go too far with this, it's going to start blowing out the color. So that looks really intense, very pink, but it's too much. It just breaks the believability. We want this to be believable, and we want it to look pretty good. And we also want to be careful not to go too much warmth, because that'll actually make it a little bit too pink. It's actually nice if you keep it a little bit cold and add that tint, then you still end up maintaining some of the blues, and it becomes a nice sort of purple instead. So what I'm going to do is just find a nice balance between this, somewhere around 9,000, and I'm going to just do this visually. So right now it's starting to look pretty good. You can see the histogram, everything's there, everything's contained. I'd still like to pick up some more details here, so I'm going to introduce a new tool. This is a brand new version of Lightroom that I just installed last night before this lesson. It's actually very convenient that we're able to work on the newest versions. I also installed Photoshop CC 2015 that just came out. They added a few new tools. For the most part in Photoshop, a lot of the things that we've been doing, painting, masking, all those things have stayed the same for 10 years. We've always been able to use those things, become more refined. But occasionally they add some fun new tools. And in Lightroom, this time they added something called dehaze. Dehaze is actually pretty cool because it's kind of like the micro contrast we've been doing in Color Efex Pro. The thing is it's hidden all the way down on the bottom. You're actually going to find under Effects, where you usually have the post-crop vignetting, you're going to find this dehaze amount. Now, I wouldn't call this hazy, but it is a little bit flat. You can see that it almost has a slight neutral white, maybe 10% white over the whole thing. That's because I was shooting long exposure, and it just kind of creates a natural haze the longer your exposures are. So let's go ahead and start to turn this up and see what happens. Oh, that's actually pretty nice. Now it's adding micro contrast into the scene, so it looks pretty good. So I'm going to give it a pretty intense amount. And this is different than contrast because it's also protecting the highlights. So now that I have the dehaze set, let's go back up here and just make some minor adjustments again. Maybe I can pull the exposure up just a little bit so it's a little bit brighter, pull the highlights down, and maybe even drop the whites a little bit. What I'm really specifically concerned about are these highlights here. I don't want them to blow out, but I also don't want to crush the shadows. So here we go, just a little bit of shadow adjustment here, and I think that's going to do it. We can add vibrance. You have to be very careful because too much is just going to make it too pink. I'll add a little bit just to pop that vibrance, and we'll go ahead and take it into Photoshop and make it one step further. So we'll say export, export with previous. I've already worked on this one once to prep it, so I'm going to overwrite. Now that this layer is in Photoshop, just for reference purposes, I'm going to go back into Lightroom. I'm going to reset the tone, reset the vibrance here, and I'm also going to go down and make sure that I'm going to reset the dehaze. And the reason I want to do that is I want to go and see a quick before and after of what we've done so far so that we can go ahead and measure it. I also have to remember to go ahead and set this to as shot so that I can pull that down. I'll say export, export with previous again. I'll go ahead and use unique names this time so I don't overwrite my own file. There we go. So we'll go ahead and bring this one in here. And now we have before and after. So you can see now it's starting to look like a really beautiful, vibrant sunrise. And again, we can adjust the opacity if we don't like what we did, took it a little bit too far. We can go ahead and adjust it, and then we can go ahead and also merge the layers back down so we have a new result that was maybe 90%, 95% of that option. So right away, we're seeing that we've already done most of the work, most of the color work inside of Lightroom. There's also something that's very dangerous right here. Most of the tones in the sky are highlight tones. So if we start to add contrast, if we use Nik Collection, we add different kinds of tonal contrast, it's going to pump that detail and make it very contrasty, where we might want the subtle, soft tones of the sky instead. So as we move forward on this one, the first thing that I'm going to do is just talk about some of the object removal. Now this was shot at f8, which is very good. f8 with a 5-stop, 4-stop, 5-stop, or a 10-stop neutral density filter on it, and the grad is really great because we can do 60-second, 120-second exposures, even up to 200-second exposures, and we're not going to get that accumulation of problems in the sky. So the only thing that we're going to get is some of those water spots again, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new layer to adjust those water spots, use the spot healing brush, and we're just going to go in really quick and paint these out. You can see that even though I'm shooting at f8, I'm still going to get a few, so we'll just go ahead and get rid of them. And whether it's water or it's sky, just feel free to get rid of anything that looks strange. So some of this in here in the water may not actually be water spots, but it's just areas where something happened in the reflection. There were ducks around here swimming back and forth, so a couple of my frames had black streaks of ducks going through them. Thankfully, this one doesn't have any of that. We have some other things here, and we just want to make sure that we get rid of all of those water spots now. And that was an odd little mistake that happened there, so we'll be careful of that. There we go, that looks pretty good. This is going to be up to you guys. What I like to do is actually get rid of these little cones. And I can't do that with the spot healing brush because it's too close to the horizon line in this water bank. But check this out. If I grab the edge, just like we did in the last Iceland file when we learned how to paint Lee out of existence, I'm going to use a small flow, match the horizon bank, and this should pretty much match right up. So the same thing here, I can just start to paint. So clone here, and just get rid of this stuff. So it's light, we can get rid of it. There's not a whole lot of imprint there anymore. And I wouldn't say that this is removing the human element, because you can see all these houses and apartments in the lake back here. But what it is doing is it's just getting rid of anything that's a distraction to the eye. Another problem is, with long exposure work, if there were boats in the water, then these boats would be moving as well. And then that would be an issue because you'd have soft boats. Some people like that. I'm not really a huge fan of having anything soft that shouldn't be soft. Now obviously water is the exception, sky is the exception, but boats and things like that, I prefer them to be very, very sharp. So we had a little bit of wind. I just want to show you guys now close up here. You can see where the wind was blowing. Unfortunately, there's no way to correct this. Since the tree is going to move, we could not have shot a exposure that was shorter and blended it with a long exposure, because the tree would have moved at some point. Even with a little breeze, when you put those exposures together and try to blend them in, you're still going to have areas where the leaves move. So it's pretty much impossible at that point. So the best time to do long exposure here would be when there's no wind at all. But you have to take what you can get. I want to point something else out here too. When we start doing long exposures, and if you do consecutive long exposures, you're going to end up with hot pixels. These are hot pixels, these little dots. And unfortunately with hot pixels, you have to go in and remove the hot pixels as well. For this demonstration, since I don't want to spend the next 30 minutes removing all these hot pixels, I'm just going to get rid of any of them that look very noticeable, and any of these water spots that I need to get rid of, and sensor dust spots. and we're going to call it a day. But if this was the final image in the final production, I'd go ahead and remove those hot pixels, or as many of them as I could, because in print, when you blow this up to really big sizes, you'll start to see those hot pixels. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and bake that in. Command E is going to merge that layer, and now we have our clean result over top our original raw. Next step is to do a little bit of color correction. I'm not going to do any nick collection or anything here, but I am going to do a couple things first. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to balance the light here. This is going to be really difficult in the histogram because you see all this red right here? It's not butted up right against the edge, but if I were to create a curves layer here to try to balance that out, I just want to show you that if I close that to the edge, I can't go too far, because as soon as I start going too far, you can see that I get these hot spots. This area is starting to get blown out. So when I'm doing a curves adjustment, if I want to change the overall brightness, I have to be careful of these areas. So I don't really want to adjust it. And what I can do is I can do a global curves, and then I can maybe paint these little areas out. But I can also do something that's a little bit different. So the first thing that I want to do, I'm going to just clear this curves. I'm going to create more contrast in this image, just using brightness and contrast. So we'll go ahead and create a little bit more contrast just to make it a little bit more vibrant by default here, which is nice, about 13 to 14%. And what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use a luminosity mask to do two things. Right now I want to be able to adjust the sky. Now the sky is mostly highlights with some shadows here, but the shadows actually happen with the tree. So just like the last lesson when we talked about this, let's examine some of our individual channels here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the blue channel, the green channel, and the red channel. And as you can see, most of the darks here, most of the shadows are going to be right here around this tree. So let's go ahead and load the whole thing as a selection again. So we'll load RGB. I'm going to create a new mask here that's going to show us that RGB result. And now you can see that everything here in the black is the shadows, and then this is basically a highlight selection. So let's go ahead and throw a curves on this and see what happens. I'll go ahead and load that. I'll hide it so we can actually see. I'll create a new curves layer. When I create that new curves layer, this will be applied as a mask. So here's what's really cool. Right now, what I've done, and you can see it here, you can see that the shadows are gone. I have not selected any of the shadows, so whatever I do on this curves is now just going to manipulate the sky, those highlights, but it's going to leave this area intact. I do not want to make this any darker. The reason I'm doing this is because by pulling these values down, I can create more contrast in the sky. Now that becomes a very powerful thing to do, because by removing some of that, I can add an additional curves layer on top, and then I can pull up the curves globally. So this is what this is going to do, is it's going to offset some of that brightness so that I can get the full tonality of the image, but then I can always focus on just changing the brightness of the sky. And as I start to do that, I can make it more intense. And now that I have the sky and the highlights selected, this is leaving the shadows alone. If I want to start to change the color of this, I can. Now be careful though, because the first instinct is to add more red. People really like to make their images red when they shoot this way. You have to be careful. When you're working with red highlights, watch what happens. I'm going to move this over here. Pay attention to this side of the screen. If I change these highlights here, notice that that's color clipping. That means your color's actually broken. We're just on the verge of this red breaking, which is why I tried to tone it down. I can actually tone it down a little bit globally or raise it a little bit globally, but I have to be very, very careful. A nice thing that you can do to mitigate red is to add the complement of blue to it. When you start to add blue, it's going to add a little bit more of the purple tones in instead. So here's where I can start to control the whole feeling of this. If I want it to be more of a purple and blue cool landscape, or I want it to be sort of a red, orange, and vibrant landscape. So again, this is just color tuning and color tweaking. And it's fun because you have individual control over all the channels, and the shadows will always be intact. So it can be very, very powerful. I always like to put the properties back into the window that they go just so I can use them later. Again, let's take a look at our result here. That looks pretty good. Now I love the before and after. I mean, you really see this intense color. And again, I'm just going to go back into these curves. I didn't want to pull it down. I kind of liked these curves right here. I liked that luminosity there, so I'm going to add a little bit more brightness back into the sky. One last thing that I want to point out here is we went from Adobe Camera Raw, we made adjustments and we brought it in. We wanted to protect some of those shadows. Well, what if we feel like we didn't take it far enough? We want to make quick changes. You can actually go, and I'm going to duplicate this first. Up here in the filter, you have an Adobe Camera Raw filter, which will allow you to load this layer into Adobe Camera Raw, which mirrors the same options that we had inside of Lightroom. So if I wanted to maintain some of those shadows or bring some of those blacks up, you can see that I could still do that. So I could bring up the blacks, pull up the shadows, add a little bit of extra contrast, pull the highlights down even more, and I can have extra adjustments here on the whole image. And when I say OK, it applies it just like Adobe Camera Raw. And you can see it's subtle again, but I could get a little bit more out of these areas. Last thing that I want to do after that is add a little bit of sharpening using a high pass filter. And it accidentally switched applications there, sorry about that. Let's go to Filter, Other, High Pass. 3%. Now here's where it gets a little bit interesting. I don't want any of that water to be sharp, so I'm going to black out this mask and I'm just going to paint in the white over the tree. So let's take a look at the tree, and as I brush this in, take a look at how that tree is just popping out. We're starting to get all those little details of the tree. So this won't help with the sharpness of the softened parts of the tree, but it will help just pop it out and give it a little bit more separation from the background. I'll do the same thing on the horizon line, and I can start to get more of the details out here. I don't want to go too far into the sky, but with and without this, it actually makes the tree look a little bit more 3D in this really soft redscape here. All in all, that looks pretty good. One more time, before the original RAW to after, with some basic adjustments. This is probably the time we've done the least to an image to get the most powerful color results. And again, each image is going to vary, and sometimes you get it all right in camera, the light was perfect, everything was perfect, and those are the times when you should just leave it alone and not push it too far. So this is a good example of knowing when to stop, and knowing when to stop your color correction is just as important as knowing how far to push it. So that wraps up this lesson. Next time we'll be working on another file in New Zealand.